I'm very pleased to be your host today. My name is Dr. Sarah Farnback and I'm a research fellow here at NDARC. Before I start, I want to take a moment to make a special welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we live on, as well as any elders past, present and emerging. I'm joining you today from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra, and I'd like to acknowledge all the countries from where you're joining today as well. Saturday is an important day. It's coming up quickly, and so I'd just like to acknowledge that we're in an important week this week as well. So today we're really lucky to have a webinar by one of our star PhD students, Miss Daisy Gibbs, who's going to be presenting her PhD project to us. She's presenting on improving the evidence about supported accommodation for people released from prison. Daisy Gibbs is currently an evaluation officer working at the Burnet Institute, and her research focuses on improving service delivery to marginalised communities, including people who inject drugs and people who experience incarceration. I'd like to congratulate Daisy. She recently submitted her PhD. It's now under review. Well done, Daisy. So after Daisy's presentation, we'll be joined on a panel. We're very lucky today to have Mr. Claude Robinson joining us, who is the manager of the Rainbow Lodge program, which we are about to become familiar with during Daisy's presentation. Then after Claude has joined us, we'll have an opportunity for some questions. So please use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you've got, and I'll try to get through them in that time that we've got after the presentation. But for now, let's get started. I won't take up any more of Daisy's time. Daisy, did you want to turn your camera on? Welcome, Daisy. Hello.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Excellent. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah, and thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be online together. I recently submitted my PhD, largely thanks to Sarah, and this is work coming from my PhD that I'm going to talk about today. And before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining the call from today. I'm on Wurundjeri land, and I acknowledge any elders past and present, and any Aboriginal people who are here today. In the context of my presentation and the work that I've done, I'd also like to especially recognise the resilience of First Nations people here in Australia and globally, and to acknowledge the disproportionate burden of criminal justice involvement within some Indigenous communities, much of which is the result of ongoing effects of colonisation, which promote continued racial discrimination. I'd also like to thank my supervisors, Sarah being one of them, and to thank the staff and management at the Rainbow Lodge program and all of the clients at Rainbow Lodge who contributed to this research. My PhD and the research that I'm going to talk about today would have been categorically not possible without your support and participation, but it would also have just been a lot less fun had you not all been so generous with your time and your experience, and just been such a great bunch of legends to work with. So thank you all so much. As Sarah mentioned, you will become familiar with the Rainbow Lodge program. And so it's helpful to give a bit of an overview of the service now, and to also talk through the studies that I'm going to present on today. So Rainbow Lodge is a supported accommodation service for men who are released from prison, and it's based up in Sydney. Rainbow provides 12 weeks of residential support with a current capacity of 8 men who have recently been released from prison. They do provide residential support to men who are at different stages of the carceral process, but just speaking in terms of supported accommodation for men released from prison, they have 8 beds. And then they provide 2 years of outreach support following that. Men are eligible for the service if they're considered to be at medium-high to high risk of reoffending when they leave jail, which is based on their criminal history, education, accommodation, and a number of other demographic factors. Men also need to be 25 years or over and at high risk of homelessness when they are released from jail. And the aim of my PhD was, as the title would suggest, to improve the evidence for the impact of supported accommodation for people released from prison. And today I'll talk about 3 of the 4 studies from my PhD. Firstly, I'll talk about the systematic review that I conducted, which aimed to identify literature which describes supported accommodation, including the key characteristics of these programs, and to distill the best evidence components. I also conducted a qualitative study exploring the perspectives of clients of Rainbow Lodge to understand the challenges that they face at the time of release, and if and how Rainbow Lodge helps to overcome these challenges. And finally, the evidence from these two studies was integrated with the expertise and experience of Rainbow Lodge staff to generate a best evidence model of care for their service. So I'll talk through these three studies somewhat out of order, just to try and make sure that we're all on the same page, and hopefully that reordering generates more clarity, not less, but I guess you'll be the judge of that, and you can pop any questions in the Q&A. So a few caveats before I get started. This is a really complex space, and I'm talking about a small component of my PhD, which fits into a very large landscape of complex literature and policy. So we're very lucky to be joined by Claude for the presentation, for the discussion, after the presentation, who'll be able to give a lot of perspective to the presentation and any questions that you might have. So please do load up the Q&A because I definitely won't cover it all. And for anyone who was who saw my webinar in 2020 when I started my PhD, yes, I've reused some of my slides, but all the figures are updated, and I'll move through the background quite a bit more quickly this time. And finally, one more caveat before I go any further. While this research that I'm talking about and my thesis overall is focused upon post-release services, I do just want to acknowledge that reducing initial contact with the criminal justice system really needs to be a priority as well. Current evidence indicates that while removing an individual from the community may produce a brief incapacitation effect while someone is incarcerated, imprisonment has neither a general nor specific deterrent effect. While investment in post-release support continues to be very necessary, particularly supported accommodation, the consequences of the mutually reinforcing cycle of homelessness and imprisonment may be improved by redirecting funds from correctional systems to housing support within the community, which can support individuals before they have that initial incarceration. But moving on to post-release services. So we know that in March of this year, there were almost 42,000 people, adults in Australian prisons. And this represents a 1/3 increase over the previous 10 years. And consistent with global trends, between 2000 and 2020, the rate of imprisonment in Australia went up from 114 to 167 people per 100,000. And the majority of people in prison are there for short periods. So 35% of people in jail are being held on remand, so they haven't yet been charged. And 62% are serving sentences of 5 years or shorter. This means that the number of people coming out of jail is also increasing every year, with an estimate of around 65,000 entrants cycling through Australian prisons each year. And one of the major drivers of the rising rate of imprisonment is the high reincarceration rate. We know that each contact with the criminal justice system increases the likelihood of future contact. And in Australia, in 2018, 73% of people entering prison reported previously being in adult prison. Amongst those released from prison in 2019 to 2020 in Australia, 52% returned to corrective services either via a prison sentence or community corrections order, and almost 43% were reincarcerated within 2 years. So the high recidivism rates in Australia and globally indicate that community reintegration after release from prison is challenging for individuals. Several factors distinguish people who experience incarceration from those who don't. Mental and physical health problems, barriers accessing stable housing and employment, and alcohol and other drug issues all disproportionately affect people who experience incarceration. And these experiences contribute to the marginalisation of people released from prison and increase their risk of reincarceration. And for most people who are on this call today, I'm sure it makes a lot of sense that the risks and challenges that people experience on release from prison often contribute to and exacerbate one another. The social and health harms that are experienced by people who are coming out of jail form a synergistic relationship with each other and with the experience of incarceration. Illicit drug use, mental and physical health problems, challenges with employment and housing all exacerbate one another and increase the potential harms that arise from each. The mutually reinforcing nature of these challenges really highlights the importance of services which are able to recognise and respond to the complex range of needs that their clients may have. And supported accommodation may play a role in improving the post-release outcomes for people coming out of jail. To address the various challenges that people face upon release, supported accommodation often encompasses multiple mechanisms of support, or what I'm going to call today program components. And they might include things like case management, education, and skill development, which attempt to target those housing, economic, mental health, and AOD-related challenges that their clients experience. Supported accommodation is a pretty broad term, and services can range from group homes or scattered site housing programs where individuals are provided with their own accommodation, along with dedicated support services, which I kind of already described, things like case management or therapeutic support, including home visits or group programs. So my thesis and the work that I'm going to talk about today focused on community-based accommodation for people released from prison, excluding services with a specific primary focus, such as residential treatment for mental health or substance use treatment, or services for juvenile populations. So we're talking about services for adults that are based in the community, so not a transitional housing arrangement that is within the prison, and not things like residential rehab for mental health or substance use treatment, although supported accommodation will often target those things. It's just not the primary focus. So we published a systematic review a few months ago, and I'll go into the detail of that a bit more shortly, but just to give a high-level idea of what is currently published in the peer review literature about supported accommodation for people released from prison. Probably unsurprising, but unfortunately there's not a lot of solid evidence regarding the impact of supported accommodation, and specific evidence for the impact of the different components on client outcomes is even more sparse. Ultimately, we had 28 studies included in our review, of which only 7 were evaluations of supported accommodation, with most reporting only on criminal justice outcomes. These studies varied considerably in their design and how they measured the impact of supported accommodation, and few studies really clearly defined the different program components. All this is just to say that there is little consistency in what studies reported on and how they evaluated the impact of supported accommodation services. So clearly, we're lacking evidence to tell us, first of all, what is the impact of supported accommodation, specifically on non-criminal justice related outcomes like health and well-being, which we know are compromised by the criminal justice system. And secondly, the evidence lacks detail regarding the components of these services and how they impact client outcomes. So there is a need to improve the quality and usability of evidence to help service providers make decisions about how to design and operate supported accommodation. And one way to do this, one way to increase that usability of research evidence for supported accommodation, is to co-design a model of care that has 3 primary components. Firstly, we want to try to develop a model of care which is standardized by best evidence, which for this purpose we define as merging the best available research evidence with the expertise of service providers. Secondly, we want to ensure that this work is informed by clients' lived experiences. And finally, we want this model of care to be able to be tailored by services to suit their circumstances, such as their level of resources, staffing availability, geographical location, or specific client groups. So while I'm sure that this is familiar to most people, the language around models of care can be a bit confusing, and a lot of people use a lot of different terms. I myself have definitely been confused and owe my current level of understanding to the patients of both Sarah and Anthony, so thank you both. Sometimes this kind of work is described as a program logic or framework, but for simplicity and to make sure that we just have a shared understanding with regards to the language that I'm using and what I'm talking about today. When I say model of care, this is what I'm referring to. So we define the core components or the elements of supported accommodation which are common across all services, and then services determine the flexible activities by which they operationalize these components. And sometimes we might think of this element of the model of care as the intervention that's being delivered. The mechanism of change is what helps us to articulate why different components are expected to achieve defined outcomes, or why does this work? And then these are all aligned with the area of need, or what is the problem that's being addressed, and appropriate outcome measures to assess program effectiveness. So how do we know that the program is working? And process measures to assess implementation. How do we know that it's actually being done? So we wanted to develop a model of care for supported accommodation that brought together the evidence from the systematic review with evidence from qualitative interviews with Rainbow's clients, along with the expertise of Rainbow staff and their activities, and a review of their activities. We then refined the model of care through a co-design workshop with the staff at Rainbow Lodge. So to get back a little bit and go a little bit further into the specifics of the systematic review. I'm sorry, this is a pretty big slide on reflection, my apologies. As I mentioned at the top, the systematic review aimed to identify existing peer-reviewed literature on the impact of supported accommodation for people released from prison, to describe the key characteristics of their services, including their program components and the outcome or impact of attending the service, and to distill the best evidence components of supported accommodation for people coming out of prison. So we conducted our final search in November of last year, searching Scopus, Medline, Embase, and PsycInfo and Social Sciences Citation Index. For the purpose of our review, PRISM referred to all types of adult correctional institutions, including prisons, jails, and pre-trial detention centres. Consistent with the definition that I gave earlier, supported accommodation refers to a temporary transitional residence for adults recently released from prison, coupled with a therapeutic component, such as individual or group therapy or skills-based workshops. Studies were included if they were focused on adults aged 18 or older, and studies needed to provide a sufficiently detailed description of the supported accommodation components, such as details of the accommodation type, as well as the type and extent of support provided. Data were extracted, and then due to the considerable variability, which I've already alluded to a few times, in terms of study design and outcome reporting, we synthesized this using the SWIM method, or the synthesis without meta-analysis. We use the GRADE framework to assess certainty in the evidence at the outcome level, and the McGill mixed methods appraisal tool to assess risk of bias. In terms of the high-level results, as I already mentioned, we had 28 included studies. And again, reiterating this, maybe a bit too much, there was variable study design and the outcome reporting was pretty inconsistent. But overall, at a high level, it appears that post-release supported accommodation may reduce parole revocations and reincarceration. But to go a bit further into that, the majority of services described in the included studies were categorized as fixed site or single site accommodation, where clients lived in one central house or dwelling and support was provided on site. The most commonly reported form of support was case management, followed by group and individual therapy. And the most commonly described program components were those targeting vocational skills and employment and AOD use, followed by education. Finally, in terms of outcome reporting, as I've already mentioned, criminal justice related outcomes were the most commonly reported, with 7 studies comparing outcomes with a group who didn't receive the intervention. Outcomes included rearrest, reconviction, reincarceration, and parole revocations, so quite a few, with incidence and time to event measures most common amongst these. While we identified a positive effect direction of supported accommodation on decreasing parole revocations and reincarceration, as I mentioned, Few studies showed an unequivocal benefit of supported accommodation in terms of the other criminal justice outcomes. As I mentioned, supported accommodation for people released from prison often encompasses multiple mechanisms of support or program components that target the various challenges that people experience post-release. Despite this, there isn't really a great deal of consistency in the peer-reviewed literature in defining program components and their impact. Only one study reported on the impact of specific program components on client outcomes, so it is difficult to know what it is about supported accommodation that could improve outcomes for people released from prison. To identify the best available evidence regarding program components, we looked to see which components were most commonly reported across the included studies and what impact the services in these studies had on client outcomes. Program components, we found that the program components that targeted life skills and vocational training and employment, we found appeared to have a positive impact on parole revocations and reincarceration. So what do we know specifically about the experiences of the clients at Rainbow Lodge? As I described, we aimed to understand the perspectives of clients of Rainbow regarding the challenges that they faced when they left prison and whether and how Rainbow Lodge helped them overcome these challenges. So after I piloted the interview guide, I conducted face-to-face semi-structured interviews with 14 men over a 2-year period. This was due to multiple COVID-related interruptions to recruitment. The interviews were transcribed by an external service, and then I thematically analysed data using an iterative categorisation approach with support from my supervisors and the oversight of an Aboriginal reference group. Interviews were conducted until data saturation was determined, so I started coding and analysing data at the same time as interviewing, and data saturation was indicated once no new codes were identified when coding the final 2 interview transcripts. So we developed 3 primary themes and 7 sub-themes, which related to the challenges experienced following release from prison and how Rainbow Lodge helped overcome these challenges. I'll talk through these and we'll read out a few quotes for some of the themes and sub-themes, but I won't go into them for everything just because there's a lot to get through. And just noting before I go further that I've used pseudonyms when referring to participants to protect their identity. The first theme that I'll discuss is needing a place to live. Unsurprisingly, all of the men that I spoke with described difficulty finding an appropriate place to live after leaving prison as a challenge. Men mentioned that without secure housing options, prison became a place where they knew they would find a bed and get fed, especially in colder months. Here, one participant said, "You go shoplift and get caught to come back just through winter to get off the streets. You know what I mean? Like, I've done crimes to get somewhere to sleep because I couldn't ask for help." When it came to how Rainbow Lodge helped address the challenge of housing, men reported feeling secure knowing that they were guaranteed safe and appropriate accommodation at Rainbow Lodge upon release. The second theme that I'll talk through is related to structure and a sense of purpose. Men described feeling that their long prison histories, in some cases starting from adolescence, meant that they had missed out on developing important skills necessary for independent living. This quote from a man that I've named Edward illustrates the broad impact of these missed lessons on his life. I'm being in and out of, I got locked up when I was 15. I didn't get out of prison until I was 23. There's a lot of things that I missed when I was younger. Skills, lifestyles, everything. So I don't know. So it's all that stuff that I missed out on. Men often reported different reasons for wanting to work, including to supplement government welfare payments and feeling that work provided stability and routine after leaving the structured environment of prison. Despite this, though, finding work was commonly described as hard due to workplaces often requiring criminal history checks alongside job applications. Thinking about how Rainbow helped overcome these challenges, men described how the structured environment at Rainbow Lodge and the support of case management helped them create a sense of direction, which they described as increasing their capacity to identify and address their challenges. a man that I've named Michael, described how Rainbow helped him gain clarity and avoid criminal activities, saying, drug and alcohol counselling, all the therapy, the art, going to the beach, going to the gym and training, it clears your mind, utterly important. Because if you don't have a clear mind, then your mental health problems take over and you start thinking about committing crimes again. Finally, the third theme related to a sense of community and a sense of belonging experienced by men. The men that I spoke with described that when they were released from prison, they felt a loss of community and lacked a sense of belonging on the outside. Often men described complicated personal histories with family members or others with whom they had a shared history of crime and drug use. And these experiences were often exacerbated by feelings of institutionalization, which men described leaving them unsure about how to navigate responsibilities and relationships in the community. Here, Edward described feeling nervous after a long prison sentence, saying, it's pretty much just unsure leaving prison, but pretty much just said goodbye to everyone in prison. I just didn't know how I'd go about things outside. Pretty much institutionalized and spent a lot of time inside. I had my walls up. I was nervous. I was unsure. Men reported enjoying the sense of community within Rainbow Lodge that was generated amongst themselves, other clients and staff. This quote from a man that I've called James describes this shared history and how it helped him to open up with other clients at Rainbow Lodge, saying, yeah, I mean, they've been helpful, just having someone else to talk to, them being from a similar kind of background, been to prison, and that's it. You know, yeah, you can talk about stuff like that with them. So in summary, our findings suggest that for these men, the experience of being released from prison was complex. The lack of housing, unmet practical needs, challenges securing work, and depleted community connections were mutually reinforcing challenges, which is consistent with current literature. Helping to overcome these challenges was the accommodation that was provided by Rainbow Lodge and the structured program at Rainbow, which was reported to have been helpful in building the social capital among clients through engagement in meaningful activities and the support of staff and fellow clients with shared experiences. So bringing this together into the model of care. So far, I've described the results of the systematic review and the qualitative study. And these findings helped us draft the areas of need, core components, and outcomes and outcome measures for the draft model of care. And then in addition to these two data sources, the review of Rainbow's activities contributed to the understanding of the draft areas of need and core components, as well as flexible activities and process measures for the draft model of care. As I described earlier, we ran a workshop with the staff from Rainbow Lodge to refine the draft model of care. And through that co-design process, we developed this essentially unreadable slide, which is complete model of care, which is probably more easily understood if we just zoom in on one of the core components and look at that across the whole model of care. So looking at case management, which is the second core component, we can see what this looks like at Rainbow Lodge via their flexible activities. So this includes development of a case management plan, long-term housing applications, and support to manage parole requirements and address any health concerns. And the mechanism of change for this core component, or why we expect case management to help clients. Through the co-design process, it was determined that prioritizing clients' most immediate needs and developing solutions to these problems allows clients to focus on development and attainment of their goals. Building strong and supportive relationships with the Rainbow staff also helps to build clients' understanding of stable and safe boundaries, and overall case management allows clients to maintain ongoing engagement with the other core components. And the process measures allow us to know the model of care has been implemented as intended. And for the core component of case management, these are defined as satisfaction with the case management plan, the number of long-term housing applications that are submitted, the proportion of probation and parole meetings that are attended, and whether clients attended the GP within the first 72 hours of release. So we can see that these are all directly aligned to the flexible activities to ensure that we know that these have been delivered in the first place as they were intended before we ask whether they worked to help address clients' needs. Finally, the model of care aligns the client areas of need with outcomes and appropriate outcome measures. And in this way, services are being evaluated on outcomes which specifically relate to their service delivery in a manner which has potential to be integrated into routine practice. So we're asking, does Rainbow have an impact on the things that we expect Rainbow clients to receive from Rainbow? We're not evaluating it on any other measure beyond that. So this approach may allow for ongoing assessment of the efficacy of core components in achieving specific outcomes, which should ensure the alignment of all of the elements across the model of care. So why is this process likely to help improve the evidence for the impact of supported accommodation? And importantly, why is this valuable for services and clients? So defining a model of care in this way has a number of benefits. Firstly, this approach brings together the expertise of service providers, clients, and researchers, grounding service delivery in real-world experience and existing research knowledge. This approach aims to optimize the effectiveness, practicality, and acceptability of this kind of model of care design to clients and service providers. Secondly, this approach provides a practical solution to the problem of inconsistent service delivery and program definitions, which we found in our systematic review. Thirdly, by potentially increasing the standardization between services, this means that there will be greater opportunities to include multiple services in single evaluations. This is important for a few reasons. Given the typically small number of clients who attend these services at a given point in time, for researchers, this can limit the statistical power of evaluating a single site. And for service providers, being able to engage in a single evaluation, which has the potential to be more scientifically robust or rigorous, that kind of just gives services an opportunity to be involved in a more impactful evaluation, which gives them greater kind of a bit crude, but more bang for your buck when engaging in an evaluation may take some input or time from staff and other resources. Finally, this standardized but flexible approach means that different services can align with best evidence practice and can improve the extent to which they are able to be compared without having to adhere to a prescribed or rigid model of service delivery. So specifically what this means is, as I've probably said too many times already, the core components provide that standardization in the function of supported accommodation services. So what is it that we expect all supported accommodation services to be providing? Well, the different services are required to determine for themselves how best to operationalize the delivery of those core components via flexible activities. The strength of this research is that the proposed model of care was derived from the experiences and expertise of Rainbow Lodge clients and staff, and the co-design workshop ensured that the final model of care that we developed was directly applicable to Rainbow's service. That being said, though, the extent to which this model of care can be adopted and operationalized by other services is currently unknown. Specifically, the applicability of this model of care to services that support women and gender diverse people is unknown. And that's an important consideration because we know that different populations are likely to have unique experiences that need to be considered by supported accommodation services. While the flexible activities theoretically should facilitate tailoring by services, the feasibility of this has not yet been demonstrated, although we do have a relative degree of confidence that that is feasible. We just need to demonstrate that. So we would like to test and potentially apply the model of care to other supported accommodation services to assess the true standardizability of it and to modify if necessary. So I feel like it's all caveats today, but another caveat at this stage is that this is where we got to. So along with Rainbow Lodge, we co-designed this model of care, and work is now needed to facilitate the uptake of this into practice at Rainbow in a way which is sustainable and acceptable to both staff and clients. And that would need to include identifying appropriate methods and resources for collection and analysis of process and outcome data. And finally, it would be great to actually use the model of care to evaluate the impact of supported accommodation on those predetermined client outcomes. So the fourth study of my PhD, which I haven't spoken about today, it used linked administrative data to look at the impact of attending Rainbow Lodge on criminal justice and health outcomes. So we were able to do so, which is good. And it just provided an avenue by which to integrate measurement of relevant outcomes into the model of care, but other outcomes in the model of care require different kinds of data. So self-report data or data that would be collected within Rainbow by staff. So yes, as I said, work is needed to facilitate the uptake of the model of care in its entirety to be used for evaluation. So again, I'd like to thank the clients and staff at Rainbow. Thanks so much to my supervisors for your great patience with me, and to the co-authors on the other papers that are included in the thesis, the Aboriginal Reference Group, particularly for support and oversight on the qualitative work, and funders and ethics. And if you want to contact me, there is one paper currently and there will be more. So thank you very much. Thanks, Sarah.
Nice one. Thanks, Daisy. Fantastic. Great job. Thanks. You know, I mean, it's interesting. I haven't looked at this work for a month or two, but it's interesting looking back at it. I really love this approach still of having the different data sources and bringing them together, particularly the qualitative stories, because I think just reading through that quote about those missed opportunities to develop life skills and how to manage in the community when you're starting in prison, when you're 15, like, of course, it's so obvious, but it really gives it life by having that those quotes to look through. And it was interesting looking through it, how you could see that go all the way through from what you found in the systematic review, those programs that were looking at developing life skills amongst clients, and then that's something that you found in the study and that ended up in the model. It's really nice. Anyway, enough from me. So I'd just like to invite Claude to please turn on his camera if he's around. Hi, Claude. So just a little bit about Claude. Claude has 15 years experience working in the community sector, working in youth justice, adult justice, homelessness, mental health. He's been in senior management at Rainbow Lodge for 8 years. He was on the board there for 6 years before he finally took over the management role 2 years ago. He has lived experience with substance misuse and in the criminal justice system in New South Wales and Victoria. And he's a passionate advocate for reform in the criminal justice and prison systems, especially how it relates to First Nations people, people with substance misuse, and people with mental health issues. So welcome, Claude. Thanks for joining us today. Your experience and skills are really going to add a lot to the conversation, I'm sure. Before I ask if you've got any reflections, I'll just say, so we've got the Q&A open. So if you have any questions, please chuck them in there. But before we get to the Q&A, I'll just ask Claude. Claude, did you have any reflections or thoughts listening to Daisy present? I know you know this work really well, but listening to her present the information today.
Yeah, it was interesting. I've had different chats over the years with Daisy, and I must say that the big caveat is she had to do this through COVID, which was really, really difficult, you know. So I can't imagine doing it without COVID, let alone doing it with COVID. But she went along. I'm happy to say that, you know, a lot of the work that Daisy did and the research and what she showed and the work we did at NDARC with the model of care and all that, I'm happy to say that we have implemented into, you know, what we do now at Rainbow Lodge. So, you know, right down to, you know, our policies, procedures, what we offer to people is all changed and is very much in line with what Daisy just presented to people. And we're already seeing the impact on the people that we work with improving, you know. And since Daisy's finished, we've been very lucky to have some philanthropic funding to increase our available resources to First Nations people, which has been really huge because you know, in New South Wales, you know, we have the highest representation in the world of First Nations people in prison. So yeah, good stuff. So no, for me it was good to watch and see it all, because one thing that wasn't said was, you know, I was a resident in Rainbow Lodge 17 years ago. So I've had numerous experiences and a long association with it. So and it's changed, so it's good. I mean, congratulations, Daisy.
Oh, thank you so much, Claude. And yeah, I think large testament to your work in terms of facilitating that change over the years that you mentioned. So thank you.
Great. Okay, so we've got a question here that's come in. You sort of touched on this, Daisy, but the question is about how translatable you think these findings might be to other populations, so women, adolescents, First Nations people, and so thinking that through, what sorts of changes you would think would you need, well, what sort of considerations would you need to make to try to apply this model of care for these different groups? What would that look like? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I have no specific comments about what would need to be changed to translate the model of care to specific client populations, because, you know, we went through a fairly lengthy process to develop the model of care that we did, and I think that to test the flexibility of the model and to ensure that it is applicable to specific populations would require, you know, consultation and engagement with those client groups as well as staff of those services. I think it's, you know, it was really enjoyable to do the research they did, but really it's so important to engage with service providers who know what they're doing to generate what we have described as best evidence by merging their experiences and expertise with the current research evidence. So staff and client experiences and perspectives would be needed to do that translation. But yeah, like I said, the model of care, theoretically, we have identified what are the areas of need, what are the core components, how do we measure these things, and the flexible activities allow that application to different groups, but we would want to make sure that is the case. And with models of care like this, you can have the standard necessary components and then the standard components that are in addition to that if you're working with specific populations who have specific needs. So we've talked about the standard components, and then there may be additional components for specific client groups. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Makes sense to me, Daisy. Did you have any thoughts about that, Claude? Like thinking through the model and how it might, you know, work for the different types of people who come through Rainbow Lodge. Do you think it will fit all the different needs of clients as they come through, or do you think that it needs to be further adapted for particular groups?
Lucky we have, as I said, with the First Nation stuff we're doing now, we're actually testing that, and we don't believe so. We believe that the model that Daisy's put forward is the bedrock. You can use that whether it's with First Nations people, women or whatever, and then what we're finding with our First Nations program is then you bring in the expertise of that particular cohort. So with our First Nations, so the underlying program is the same for everyone, but we bring in the expertise of First Nations people. So we've employed peer workers, we've engaged First Nations owned programs, organisations. So all our First Nations stuff is done by First Nations people, and they say the same thing on the bedrock of what we have already done in the TSA space. And we've already had some conversations with other people about putting that into the female space and some other cohorts. So we believe with that strong base, you then bring in the specific people who or programs, or, you know, whether it's women or LGBTQI or whoever it is, you bring those experts in to facilitate the program on top of what we already have. So we believe in looking at a copy and paste model around at the moment. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess I'm just thinking as you're talking, Claude, about, that was really shown in your research, Daisy, because you did have the Aboriginal reference group that was part of the process, and looking at the qualitative data and the model of care as you went. And so maybe you could talk a little bit to how you adapted it, or what that process looked like of involving the reference group.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Just a quick comment there. I see that someone in the audience has their hand up, and I don't know if we have the functionality to receive questions by audio. So if you have the capacity to type it in the Q&A, we'll hopefully be able to get to it. In terms of the Aboriginal reference group, that involved a number of different men. I'm not Aboriginal, and so don't have the experience to comment on that. I'm also not a man. And so we wanted to ensure that the research question that we're asking, specifically with regards to the qualitative interviews, but overall, was appropriate, culturally safe in the way that I was going about it. And so one of my supervisors is an Aboriginal man, and a few men who were clients of Rainbow Lodge who are Aboriginal were also involved in meeting to discuss those things. So about the question that I was asking overall for my PhD, within specific studies, the question that I was asking, and then the way that we're going about it. So pilot testing, interviews, and then doing, feedback and kind of debriefing sessions, and then talking through the qualitative process in terms of the way that I was analysing the data, the themes that I was generating, and whether they were reflective of their experiences as Aboriginal men. Rainbow Lodge is not a service specific for Aboriginal men, but given that high incarceration rate amongst First Nations people, there are a number of beds that are reserved for Aboriginal men. So the research is not specific to the experience of Aboriginal people, but involves them quite a bit. So wanting to make sure that the way that the themes that we were generating and the way that we were presenting those findings was reflective of their experience.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and it was a lot of steps along the way. It's good to see that level of engagement. Well done, Daisy. So I've got another question here that perhaps I'll see who wants to tackle. So this one is, do you think the program could be used to give offenders shorter sentencing options? Often offenders don't qualify for parole or probation due to lack of housing options. So I think this question is about linking up the Rainbow Lodge program more specifically, more closely with the system. Did either of you want to have a tackle of that one?
Yeah, I will pass it to Claude, because I think that this speaks to what we're interested in. I just want to caveat, what we want to talk to here is generating that evidence about post-release supported accommodation. But Claude can talk to more where else Rainbow can intervene and what other support Rainbow is currently providing.
Yeah, sure. So again, because we've initiated this innovative First Nations program with our First Nations partners, and so Rainbow Lodge, since Daisy finished her research, it's changed a little bit. Previously, as she presented, all our men came from custody at the end of serving their sentence, so they're on parole and they have to be medium high. Now we have a specialist First Nations program and a couple of extra beds, and it's a diversionary program. So instead of the First Nations clients being on remand, they're as the person who asked the question, so they're diverted to us, where they're having interventions, driven interventions to see and whether it does have an impact on their reincarceration, their crime rates. And so far, the anecdotal evidence we have so far is that it is working. And I'll say, so I think when Daisy did her research, we were about 39% of our clients were First Nation, about in line with the prison population of First Nation people in New South Wales. This year we're at 67.1%. Sorry, for 2022-23, and in the current financial year, we're heading towards 80% First Nations people. So we believe we're doing something right because the community is now sending people to us and the courts are sending. So as the question says, we have a really close relationship now with the jails. We're actually looking at sending some of the programs, the First Nations programs they're running at Rainbow, into the prisons while they're on remand to tackle that question. So we do think, though we created this to help people coming out, we do think if we can get in early enough, some of the things we're doing at the end, if we do at the beginning, the benefits will benefit everyone, especially, you know, the people in the system.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, I hadn't realised that, Claude. That's really great to link that up, and that follows really nicely onto the next question by Kylie on the chat, which is around does the program report to corrections or parole as part of your kind of usual processes? Like, what's that level of engagement and reporting like?
Yes, so for our TSA clients, so the clients that they did a study on, so all our clients have to be referred through community corrections. They can't refer out. They can't just ring Rainbow and we don't have an intake. It comes through what's called a portal because they have to have an LSIR. Their rating is medium, high. It comes on a portal and their parole officer in prison will set them tasks, so case management tasks. So we don't even get to choose that as part of our funding agreement. That's all put in action. So we have to report to correction. So, you know, as we're going along, that basic ones will be, you know, maybe mental health, housing, AOD use, cultural activities. These are some of the case management settings by corrections. And then when the client goes, as they go through, I report on that. How many weeks they've stayed here, have they engaged in that, any of those tasks. And when they finish, the length of service is 12 weeks. So at the end of that service, then I have correction on that. So we have, lots of reporting with corrections. But we have a really good relationship with them too. So a quick thing, so for the last financial year, we just got our report back. So we received 127 referrals for the 32 placements that they fund us for. To put that in context, we had more referrals than all the other TSA services put together. So for every bed, we had 4 referrals.
Yeah,
and that doesn't include the Aboriginal program we're running. That's separate again. So, but we completed 75% of the case management tasks for the people that came through. So our reporting with corrections is very, very high, and it's done. So generally they'll send a report every quarter on where everyone is. So yeah, we are constantly reporting to corrections and answering to them. Yeah,
and clearly, you know, the reputation of the service is really well known to be getting, you know, those kind of outcomes, and clearly that's known around the sector for that level of uptake. That's great. Congratulations, Claude. You should be really, really proud of that. It's amazing. Someone's just put in the chat, such powerful work, and it really is. Like, it's really making a difference quite clearly. And I think that's the great thing about kind of, you know, Daisy's work, is it's coming to give you some more evidence to really tell that story.
I think Daisy's PhD in the worksheet, that couldn't have come, like the stars couldn't have lined at a better time for Rainbow, because it gives us a really good foundation, because we're in a huge period of change, and that really gives us a solid measurement, you know, because one of the things that is the problem for a service our side is we just don't have the resources to be able to do the data and stuff like that. So to have someone come and do their PhD on your service being so small, like, you know, that is gold for us, and we would never be able to have this level of research and that done with, you know, without this opportunity. And the flip side of that is, so, you know, you can never go to people, they go, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? You know, and we can't afford to get the evidence. So it is a real problem for smaller services. So it really has set us on a path for the future, you know.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great, yeah, it's a great example of that sort of partnership approach between universities where you can really work together to achieve something that's useful. So I'm just conscious. Sorry, go on.
I'll just say, I'll be honest, because you know, I was on the board when it was put forward to do Daisy's research, and of course, and a service strapped for money. You know, I was like, oh no, we could use that money at the front line. But I'm glad, you know, some other people, you know, sort of said, you know, on the board, and we, you know, but we want money, but they ask us for the evidence, but we never have it. So, you know, again, we had to make that decision because we had this bit of money, you know. So I am glad that wiser minds overruled my thinking, and we did that, because in the long term, it has been of much more benefit. That money would have got chewed up on incidentals, you know, but we now have this body of work. So for us, it's really important.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I'm conscious of time, but there's one more question in the chat that I just want to try and get to if we can. So this is a question around, would you offer placements, Claude, at Rainbow Lodge for individuals on home detention orders? Is that part of the service model?
So again, because we're funded through community corrections, if they have to meet medium, high or high, so they have to be at high risk of reoffending. Generally, if they're on home detention, they may have a bracelet, so that, you know, it just depends if they can get the applicable order to do it. So the Aboriginal program that we're one with the lower on the list, they are ostensibly on home detention with us or house arrest, you know. So yeah, they're not allowed to leave without staff, you know, and things like that. So we do that. Again, I think we would take 30 calls a month from people who are in the community who would love to come to Rainbow, and if they don't, their trajectory generally would be back to in prison. But, you know, as we have 32 places, and 19,500 people get released every year in New South Wales from prison. So it's a never ending.
We were chatting about that before we came online. Yeah, I mean, you know, clearly there's a massive need, and it's this old discussion, isn't it, about prevention versus, you know, sort of treatment, and having, you know, there's clearly a massive need. The cost associated with leaving it too late and having people in the justice system is so huge. I'd love to see Rainbow Lodge get more funding to be able to expand, to get bigger, and to expand the sector.
We are in talks with government to get another house currently. So
great.
We'd like to have a First Nation specific house, because that's gone so well, and then have our mixed house. So yeah, for the first time we are in talk with government and increasing our funding. But I must say, the only reason we've been able to do that is because we've got philanthropic funding to run our programs, to show the government. But you know, so without, and that is a big thing, you know, we do need that private funding, because to take those risks and look outside the box, then go to government, you know, and go, hey, this works, you need to fund it, you know. So we wouldn't be in the position we are now without that.
Yeah, right. Well, good luck. I hope it comes off. That's fantastic. So unfortunately we're out of time for today. So thank you very much. I really just want to thank you, Claude, for spending some time with us this afternoon to add some life to the research that Daisy's done and tell us what it's like in practice. And a special thank you to Daisy as well for presenting your PhD research. It's really exciting. We look forward to seeing your papers come out over the next little while as well. So thank you both. So just before I finish, I just want to plug next week's webinar. I think we'll have a slide come up with next week's webinar. Fantastic. So we hope that you can join us next Thursday, as always, at 3 o'clock for this exciting presentation by Ben Riordan. Excellent. Thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic afternoon.